You guys hear me? Okay, I'm Brian from Intel, and today I'm going to present this presentation on multi-vendor verb support. I have some co-creators of this presentation, Saqib Jang from Chelseo and Nishant from Cavium. They're not here today, so I get all the glory. But we do have some folks here that helped create the content. I'd like to call out Don Wood and Shiraz Salim from Intel. Shiraz is here. Michael Chang from Chelseo. And then Mikhail Calderon from Cavium. If you see any mistakes in anything, please talk to them. Okay. All right. I have a disclaimer. It's the Intel disclaimer, but oddly it's different from everyone else's disclaimer. I did put a blue comment at the bottom that kind of specific to this presentation. We're presenting a lot of information about verb support of different products, but I just want to emphasize we aren't trying to define Cavium or Intel or Chelseo's POR for products. So if you want authoritative information on those products, please talk to the representative from those companies. Okay, of course, OpenFabrics Verbs has been around for a long time. Over the years, it's grown beyond the sort of classic RDMA API. It now includes non-networking or non-RDMA networking features and also some sort of verbs vendor-specific features. And so this presentation is trying to promote something I'm calling multi-vendor OFV, which is the subset of verbs that's supported by a majority of surveyed NIC vendors. And at the moment, the survey is covering a subset of the Ethernet vendors that support IWARP and RNIC. That isn't meant to be restrictive. It's just the folks that I knew and the time that I had to collect the data. The goals of this are to make it transparent and easy for RDMA developers to, application developers to know which verbs, to be confident which verbs would work across a wide variety of NICs. And then I think it would be interesting to try to start driving an industry conversation amongst all the NIC vendors and developers and end users on how we could expand the list over time. What things do people really want to see on that, have that broad NIC support. One thing important to note, I don't want to make anyone feel like we have a goal to eliminate NIC innovation or product differentiation. I think that's one of the beautiful things about verbs. There's a lot of new features being added all the time. We wouldn't want to curb that at all. Okay, these are the details on the NICs I was able to survey. The Intel NIC is the Ethernet connection X722. This is a 4x10 NIC that's integrated into the Perley platform, the server platform. Then we have two Cavium NICs. These are the 41,000 and the 45,000 series. These are up to 10 or 25 or up to 100 gig NICs, and they support either IWARP or RNIC v2. And then Chelseo has the T5 and the T6. The T5 is a 40 gig, and the T6 goes up to 100 gig. So all of these NICs are included in this description. Okay, now I'm going to have a bunch of tables, and so I thought I would put a slide in here that kind of describes the columns of the tables and makes a few comments before we dive into those. The first comment is, all these tables are just defining what all the different verbs that I'm defining as multi-vendor. And then it's important to point out that each NIC vendor here supports more verbs than are shown in the tables. The tables are meant to show all of the common verbs that are supported across all the NICs, or at least a majority of the NICs. And then the table column descriptions, well, you've just got three columns. You've got the verb. You've got, here I show resize CQ and IBEV post send. You've got some parameters that are excluded from the multi-vendor definition. I think that column is only used for post send for, we excluded atomics and XRC and TSO. And then The support exception, the NIC support exception column shows any exceptions across all the surveyed NICs. So you can see here for resize CQ, the X722 and the KVERBS chips have hardware support for that, but they haven't released the software for it yet. And then T5 and T6 currently not supporting resize. If that field is blank, as you see down in post-send, that means all the NIC vendors are claiming full support for that verb. Make sense? Okay, now I have 10 pages of tables that look like this. And I know you guys want me to go through each row individually, but I think instead I'll just make some high-level comments about these to move things along. Because really what I want to do is not focus on the details here, but just try to get some gauge of interest in this concept. And so I'm really just presenting this, and hopefully I'll have some feedback at the end on whether you like this idea or not. So these are all the user verbs roughly related to device or PD characteristics. And what I would say here is, you can see there's no real exclusions of parameters, and there's no NIC support exceptions. So I think the surveyed vendors are supporting these pretty well. As I mentioned earlier, this just goes through the completion and event UVERBS. As I mentioned earlier, the resize CQ is something that not everyone is doing yet. It seems like we left it in there because it seems like the support for that is trending broadly. And then here we have the UVERBS, the QPair and memory UVERBS. As I mentioned, you can see there the post-send. Not everyone is supporting atomics, XRC, or the TSO feature. So those are excluded at the moment. And then the memory window verbs, I think, are pretty much all the vendors we looked at are planning future software releases for those. So the good news there is it seems like everyone is claiming hardware support, and they just need to get their software written. Okay, here's SRQ and connection management. The Intel X722 and the Chelsea T5 don't support SRQ, but other NICs surveyed do. And then you can see that the connection management verbs are all nicely supported in user space, of course, by all the vendors. Okay, now moving right along to kernel verbs. Again, the device verbs are well supported and no exceptions. And then this is a continuation of those, including the PD-related verbs. You can see there that P-key doesn't apply to iWarp, so there's an exception noted for that. And then here are the completion and event and QPair verbs. The resize CQ, I may have mentioned that before. That's one that's not universally supported. The X722 will support that in a future software release, and the T5 and T6 don't support it. And then here are all the QPair verbs in the kernel. As I mentioned, atomics, LSO, and signature memory regions aren't supported or excluded there at the moment. And then all the other verbs in this category are well supported by the hardware vendors. Okay, I'm getting close to the end here. So we have the memory region verbs in kernel. Those are all pretty nicely supported except for signature and gaps MRs. And then SRQ is sort of the same story as we had in user space. Good support across the vendors except for the Intel X722 and the T5. Okay, I think that's it except for connection management. And connection management is a lot of verbs, and everyone supports all of them with no exceptions. Okay, so that was a lot of data. I just wanted to make some kind of high-level characterization of all those tables. And I sort of decided, well, how can I bound this? It's sort of bounded by what it includes and what it excludes. I think we've captured the essential verbs that are widely used across many mainstream applications, and also supported by all the surveyed, a majority of the surveyed NICs. But there are some examples of things that are excluded. All the verbs, we left out all the verbs with EX suffix. We left out UD and XRC because we didn't see broad support for those across the NICs, atomics and TSO ops. The flow verbs, application-tailored cookie formats, per CQ event moderation, signature and gaps MRs and T10 diff, and the old style of FMR were examples of things that are not included here. I'm almost done, so we can be early for lunch. But the main point or the main goal I had in presenting this was to see if it's interesting to the audience. And I thought it might be interesting to poll the audience. I realize that never goes well because no one raises their hand. But what I would like to do is ask the audience, say for example, developers, is it interesting to have a list like this that you can refer to so that you know when you're developing apps which verbs will work across all the different NICs surveyed. Is that something that everybody would like to see us continue, or there's some interest there? Okay.
Yes. I think you should just maintain something like this in RDMA core in the documentation.
Okay.
Right? That's very similar to what LibFabric is doing for its kind of compatibility matrix.
All right.
The reason we can't do the same, you need to have more than 2 drivers, though. I think we're up to something like 10 drivers. So.
Right. I completely understand we need to broaden this, and that's one of my next steps on my last slide.
But even having a standard format for each driver to report, in a manual page or something, what it supports would be, I think, very, very good.
Would be great, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
And
again, it gets a little bit tricky on support. You can say you support, for example, a capability verb to query for something that you don't support. There is a little bit, I think it would be worth some interaction to decide what support means in the context of each and every verb.
A lot of the verbs you listed there, in my mind, they're mandatory. Right. There's no need to consider them for compatibility because if you don't implement them, your driver probably isn't in our tree. Quite a lot of them fall in that category, and
right.
it is true. Even if you implement them, only just say no, I don't support what comes next. You do actually have to implement that feature.
Right.
We haven't been. I don't think we've really well specified that kind of sense. So it would probably really good to formalize that. I mean, if that was an end product of what you're doing here is to say these are mandatory, all drivers have to implement them.
Yeah.
I would think that would be excellent as well.
Okay. Super. I'm glad you like that. And then I was also thinking it might be useful for RDMA end users if we went through an exercise of defining which applications conform to the multi-vendor verbs. That one I was thinking, oh, that'll be easy. I'll just grep through the app and see what verbs it calls. But just because a verb calls something not on my list doesn't mean it doesn't conform to multi-vendor verbs. So I think we'd have to have a pretty thorough review, including the developers of the apps, to really know for sure how to classify them.
Can we automatize this? So what I would like to have is set some kind of an environment flag, and if I run an application, it should flag all the calls that may not be portable in my app. Maybe put that in the kernel log, and then I can inspect the kernel log and see, okay, I might have to pay attention to the following components of my application when I want to run this on a different vendor's NIC.
Right. Okay.
I think if you were to do that, you would have to have it be a little stricter. You'd not just have to log the calls, but you'd have to start returning failures on cap bits and query things to say, no, this emulation mode I'm in doesn't support this. So the applications, if they have fallback paths, can go and use them. And I think that would be generally useful because it is actually hard to test the fallback paths in the applications if the only hardware you have supports all the features.
Well, if you know it, it's at least you know what to look for. If we can get it much further than that, it would be great.
Yeah, I think that having like a list of supported stuff between vendors is a good informational thing, but I'm not sure that classifying a multi-vendor verb, even that term, seems wrong, and I'll explain why. First of all, it's not just multi-vendor, it's multi-devices. So each vendor has, in each iteration, it has more features. So even if within a single vendor, you're completely fragmented in that. The second thing is, let's say an API philosophy. When we add features, usually we have two kind of dilemmas. The first is, do we want to have like capability or feature flag for each, like say we have 3 features, A, B, and C, so I want to say, I want to know if A is supported, B is supported, or C is supported. The second way to handle that is to have like a version that says, in version 1, none of them supported, in version 2, A, B, C are supported, in version 3, D, E, F are also supported. But that has a drawback in the sense that you kind of have a lookup table of features inferred by the application according to the versions. Everybody needs to know now what a version stands for. Mm-hmm. So what we try to do is whenever we have like a feature that's more or less self-contained, I'm trying to think of a good example. I know, let's say that, what? Yeah, well, yeah, let's say ODP if I want to know if I do page faults and also invalidations. I mean, I'm going to implement both of them at the same time. So I'll have a feature called ODP. But I'm not going to have a version that says the multi-vendor verb version 3, anybody that complies that must support ODP.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
We're going to run into a hell of a lot of problems on that.
Well, we've got plenty of exceptions even on this list. Right. Yeah.
So I'm looking at other APIs in the industry, and I know, like graphics, they have, you query a feature or family, you get an interface, or you get a family of APIs for a certain feature. I think that's the way going forward, and the way we probably need to improve a lot our feature query subsystem. So as an application, you, in a simple manner, instead of trial and error, again, there are cases like the canvas that Jason mentioned that's probably it's too complex even to describe it, but in many cases we need a good system to query capabilities. So I think as an application writer, what you do, it's having a survey, or maybe it's good because then you know what's the majority of devices that you can develop to. But other than that, your application needs to be able to query certain features and use them, or fallback for more basic stuff if it can't. I don't think that there is a value of having these versions. It's harder to maintain.
Yeah, so we could translate this or transfer all of this from PowerPoint and Excel into, just some app that goes and runs all these queries, and you code the responses for each product into those, into those query responses, I guess is what you're saying, right? And that would make a very dynamic and more fine-grained approach than what I have here, which I'm in favor of.
No, I mean, as a way to do documentation, we can automate something like that. But in terms of like defining a standard of what multi-vendor verb V1 stands for, I think that's not the way forward. When you have a new technology, you have some baseline, like RDMA started, but after that, you have per feature capabilities.
Yeah, I don't really care if we have something called multi-vendor verbs. I just came up with that term just for this presentation. I do think though that there isn't a lot of knowledge, or there isn't an easy way to find out this kind of information at the moment. And so I think having a more transparent means of getting this information would be nice.
2.5 comments, not questions, but comments. First, I can't imagine that the OFA would not be interested in taking this activity on under the guise of the OFV working group. This seems to be, to me, tailor-made for that working group. That's one. Okay. The second was, it sort of lends itself to the idea kind of where you were just going with Laurent, to some sort of a logo or some sort of a logo processor interoperability program or something that says, we conform to the following set. So I'm going to suggest that you get involved with Paul Bowden. Paul, where are you? There you are. You should drag him into this. And the third one is, this is just an observation on my part. I think this would be interesting to see how this plays out in light of the direct verbs that was discussed in an earlier session, sort of going the other direction. Anyway, that was my provocative thought.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
I have one more. more thing to bring up. So in the Verbs API, in the last couple of years, we've seen the development of some new APIs that are not bound to hardware features, like the disaggregated completion collection. And so far, none of the other hardware people have implemented the software support for these. It requires no hardware support, it's just driver work. Kind of useful to have a discussion about that, maybe in the OFV or something, what we should be expecting there. Because it is necessary to move some of the core API forward in a way that does not come with it with a hardware requirement, but it does require a software commitment, across the board to kind of implement, so that applications can use these new APIs, which are easier to program for.
Yeah, and again, I think that was one of my points is if we can, once somebody has an established API and they see that vendors aren't supporting it, it would be nice to have a forum where we can all get together, and maybe the OFV is the place to do that, and complain about one another, to make sure that the NIC vendors are properly motivated to take those opportunities. Yeah.
Okay. Otherwise, I also like the idea of a tool that just gives you a report.
Yeah.
I like
Okay,
that.
that's a good idea.
One comment on the issue of direct verbs. So I think that in a lot of cases there could be, let's say, technologies that start to evolve that it's actually good to have them in vendor-specific areas. And with the RDMA core now, we're still upstream, but it's vendor-specific. The difference that we make in Mellanox between using these two paths usually correlates to the standard. Whenever we adhere to the standard, we or don't contradict the standard, we put it in the public space. Whenever we have something that's not standardized yet, we put it in vendor. And I think this is kind of it's a good thing. So vendors can innovate in their vendor-specific portions, and anything that makes a generic concept makes it into verbs. Now, of course, Linux implementation of verbs is not one-to-one mapping of the IBTA standard or the RDMA consortium. Usually it has semantics that are built on top of it, like application-specific accelerations or new memory layouts. And these are stuff that are actually, it's good because they complement the wire protocol and they don't contradict it. So having these two approaches, you can start new stuff, innovate in your private place. And anything that doesn't contradict the standards in terms of interoperability and is a broad concept, we can push it directly into the public place as a new feature with the proper capabilities. So for example, today when I introduced the device memory, I think it's a generic concept. Yep. It doesn't contradict the wire protocol or IBTA in any way. Anyone can implement it. It sounds like a good idea. So I wouldn't push that into a provider verb. Same goes with timestamps and stuff like that. As Alex mentioned, the DC transfer currently is not yet standardized, so we start with there. But the nice thing about that is when it's standardized, we can then push stuff into a standardized API. And because we're using a different namespace, right, we have the public portion and we have the vendor, we're not in any danger of breaking anything. So there could be a migration process when applications start maybe using one vendor-specific feature, but once it's made a generic concept, they can migrate to the new API, and in any case, there are no conflicts.
I think that sounds about right to me.
So just since we still have some time in this session, I thought I might
Yeah,
expound on Laurent's point there. So from kind of an upstream perspective, when looking at proposals for new APIs in verbs, the guideline we want to see is if you want to put it in verbs, you need to describe it to a level where all the other vendors can implement it. Okay, that is the threshold, the minimum threshold. Then it has to go on the mailing list for a while to give everybody else the time to comment. So, if you're another hardware vendor and you're thinking about might want to support some of these things, you do have to watch the list. You have to have your architects and silicon people, weigh in and say if this is okay for you. Because if you want to object, this is your chance. Otherwise, it goes into verbs, into RDMA core, and it becomes enshrined in the API. And if you come around later, you're going to have a much harder time to get it tweaked, right? This is, invest your time up front, to have the best result for the entire community. Yeah.
Okay, good point.
Just to comment on what Liron said, I don't think interoperability is the only factor that decide whether it is a private extension or not. I mean, IBTA InfiniBand standard also describe how the verbs are used. For example, with memory region, it describes all the memory management and how memory is defined. And if we take what we saw today on scatter, gather, list memories, this is something not defined in the IBTA. The IBTA defined only part of this, only regular memory region. So the OpenFabrics API does not define all the semantics. It doesn't explain all the semantics of this. So,
yeah, and
so
I think that's...
I'm not sure extensions like this. I think that extensions like this should also be private extensions of a specific vendor, unless there's some standardization of them.
Well, and I think to your point, that's probably one reason why other NIC vendors haven't implemented some of those things yet. And I think, creating a forum for discussing this and trying to get, creating an interested group of people to try to expand the definition of what's supported across NIC vendors would maybe drive those conversations about the gaps in definitions.
Of course, Christoph.
I think we have some problems with maintainership here. This is not how it's supposed to be and how other subsystems do this. If somebody introduces a new feature, then it is not introduced in just that vendor's driver. The responsibility of the person who makes the change is to change it through all the drivers and all the vendors and get acceptance from everybody before it's committed to the tree. And so anybody can work on anybody else's device as well in order to make sure that everybody supports these features. Mm-hmm. That may not be possible on the hardware level, but if it is a feature that's only software-wise there in the driver, then we need to make sure that any new feature and stuff is supported throughout. And we need to put an effort into this to make sure that all the drivers are updated, not only by the vendor, but if they are not reacting, then somebody else should be doing it and make sure this is all consistent.
That's true. And we've done that for a lot of things, but it's not necessarily everything got done, unfortunately. Particularly the really, really complicated things didn't get tackled, and it's unfortunate. It's a mistake. I view it as a mistake. But just to answer sort of your point, within the RDMA core and libIBverbs world, we do not require new functionality to be standardized by any sort of formal standards body. That we're a software project in Linux. That's not really our mandate. If the vendor community feels that the things need to be standardized before vendors will enshrine it in silicon, then yes, the IBTA is an appropriate venue to bring that up and get that kind of multi-vendor agreement. And I would hope that discussion would be informed by any implementations that already exist in Linux, right?
Yep.
Well, that's what I said. Our standard for RDMA core is if you want to introduce a new API, you must describe it to a level that all the other hardware vendors can implement it. That is the standard. So if you feel there's an API that has not been described to that level and you want to do it, bring up some questions and they will be answered. They will be answered.
Okay.
Okay?
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to compliment Jason's remark that, a software implementation doesn't match, at least in the IBTA case, the verbs one-to-one. For example, in IBTA in the kernel, you have to use a local key for everything, and in Linux, we have a DMA-MR. The implementation differs. And there are other semantic stuff. There's this new read-write API for storage devices, which is an abstraction that now a lot of storage ULPs use, and it's not in the IBTA standard. Read-write API in the kernel. So anything new that we introduce as a new public API, of course, has to be thoroughly documented. The semantics have to be 100% clear, both in terms of what an application receives from the API, and also what that translates in the actual wire protocol. In fact, whenever we have such completely new concepts introduced, we try to push an RFC. We push in RFCs in the mailings, and also we have the meetings. For example, in the device memory case, we actually had 2 or 3 OFV working group meetings on this area. One on user space, and I think another one on the kernel APIs, in addition to the RFC that was sent months ahead into the mailing list. And that thing, if there's any problem with the semantics or something that we're missing, then that's the chance to comment. But if not, if you're not on time, then and the semantics are clear, I don't see any problem with making that a new concept.
Okay, this is sort of what I wanted to have happen in this presentation, where I presented for 15 minutes and then everyone else talked. If everyone was bored and no one said anything, I was going to take that to mean that I should just shut up and go home. But it seems like there's some interest in this topic. It doesn't have to move along exactly as I defined it here. I'm very open to getting into maybe the OFV meetings and starting to talk about it there. I'm taking away from this that maybe it's a good idea to follow up a little bit and try to move this along. There are some next steps that I defined. I don't know how critical it is to describe it here, but obviously we would want the missing NIC vendors, the very important missing NIC vendors, to participate in this. We would want to be able to expand the definition over time. I think we would like to be able to do that survey of OFV apps to see which would be conforming. And then detail, we don't really have the REMA underscore verbs treated very consistently in the tables you saw at the moment. Some of them were defined as included in the list, and some of them were defined as out of scope since they're simple wrapper functions. So forgive me that that's a little bit inconsistent, and I think we'll work that out over time. We'll probably end up including all the RDMA underscore verbs just for completeness. Okay, thanks a lot for your time.